Welcome once again into the Radiopaedia reading room. Yes, it's me. I'm back from my family holiday in New Zealand. It was great. Thanks for asking. There was zip lining, whitewater rafting, helicoptering, scenic flightering, not even words, Fergburgering. But most importantly, there was absolutely no radiologying. But this, of course, is a radiology podcast. My name is Andrew Dixon, and joining me, I'm trying my very best here to delay him speaking for as long as possible because Lord knows we're going to hear more than enough of him throughout the remainder of this episode. It's my co-host, Frank Gaillard.
Welcome home, Dixon. How's the land of hobbits? Do you feel refreshed?
Not at all. Not in the slightest. It was all children and in-laws and go, go, go. An absolute hemorrhaging of money as well. The cost of living there is out of control.
Yeah.
$10 for a coffee, and they were terrible coffees.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's how I measure cost of living. But many good times were had, and definitely very happy to be back home. Now, how about you? How are your school holidays going with the kids?
I mean, it's a bit early for a goat, isn't it? But I've probably mentioned this before, but I'm very conflicted about school holidays in general. On the one hand, I love hanging out with thing one and thing two and just geeking out.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I pretty much regret every decision that has led me to having children and a wife, and I just want to go full Unabomber and live in a cabin and grow my beard and not wash somewhere.
I hope your kids aren't listening to this one.
Not to mention that actually during this whole time, we've had some very pernicious, annoying bugs that just won't go away from the website and are causing all sorts of grief. And so, hobbits, even with $10 coffees, sounds much nicer.
Yeah. You said thing one and thing two, and that reminds me, I've got these pajamas that have got thing one and thing two on them. And one of my favorite lines is, when you're staying over at friend's house or something and you walk out in your pajamas, they go, "Oh, you've got thing one and thing two." And I'm like, "Yep, if you see thing three, let me know." It's just one of my favorites.
So not going off on a tangent, but when I was at uni, I used to go to the gym before uni class. And at Melbourne University, the gym is on one side of the campus and the medical school is on the other. I mean, it was like summer and I'd have like a wind sheeter or a hoodie or something and I'd tie it around my waist if it was too warm. And I got to the medical school having walked all the way through campus and had not realized that thing three was just waving around saying hi to the world.
That's a classic. Now, we better get back to the topic here. So while I was away last week, Frank, in New Zealand, I caught word that one of the few other non-journal associated radiology podcasts in existence, RadCast, had announced that they were hanging up their microphones. I'm not sure if that's a term, but finishing their podcast after 6 years and 67 long-form interviews. And you won't be surprised to hear, Gaillard, that Uzoma and Jamie, the hosts of RadCast, in their final episode, spoke about how the time and energy that it takes to arrange, record, and edit the interviews is one of the major reasons for them calling it a day. Plus, more importantly, I guess, they said that they've kind of achieved everything that they set out to achieve.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all, really. This takes so much longer than one would guess, particularly the back and forth organizing the interviews. That's a significant amount of time. It's a shame because long format interview podcasts have a definite niche and it sort of gives people a chance to get a bit deeper and get more comfortable with the interview than on shorter formats. But I'm not surprised and I 100% understand their decision, Dixon. Yes. I'm not foreshadowing anything.
So back in early 2023, just before we started this podcast, you, Frank, were a guest on RadCast.
I was.
You were on their list of important radiology people. They must have missed me, that they wanted to interview when they set out 6 years ago. And so as a bit of a tribute to RadCast, I thought, with their permission, that it might be really nice to play that interview as the main segment for today's podcast. So that's what we're going to do.
And best of all, Dixon, this counts as one of the episodes I created.
Oh, no, that's not true. I've spent some time trimming about 20 minutes of audio from this episode. So it's officially a Dixon episode, and the score remains 39 Dixon, plays 6 from Gaillard. But what is really great about this one, Frank, is that many people in the past have actually written to us and asked, can we talk about the story of Radiopaedia on the podcast? We've always kind of shied away from it because, Frank, you've told the story many times and I've heard it way too many times. But I must say, listening to Uzoma and Jamie interviewing you is much more kind of organic and genuine, a way to experience the story than me and you talking directly to each other. So I think this will actually work really well. And they're such nice guys that they actually allow you to bang on way more than I would ever tolerate.
Oh, they did, didn't they? It was a really good experience, actually. I had to listen back to it before this episode. And what I'm happiest about is that they got me to elaborate on some of the reasons why Radiopaedia exists and how I kind of think about these problems rather than just a timeline. This happened and then this happened. And you won't be surprised to hear, I think.
I won't be surprised to hear anything.
That many of the issues they managed to get me to bang on about, listening back to, it's over a year ago, it's like, yeah, that is a really good point. That is really important. Yeah. I'd love to talk about that even more.
No, it is a good reminder, isn't it? So, as I said, I've trimmed a little bit from the original recording. It's still quite long, though, but yeah, I think everyone's going to thoroughly enjoy it. There's a couple of bits, Gaillard, where I thought if you were answering the same question now rather than 14 months ago when it was recorded, I reckon your answer would be very different. So perhaps we can chat about those when we get to the outro for this one. So before we do that, once again, thanks to RadCast for 6 years of great interviews. And if the two of you ever want to dust off the microphone again and record a main segment for our podcast, then you'd be very welcome to get involved.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, it's a great idea. All right, so let's get into it. Here is Frank Gaillard telling and telling and telling the story of Radiopaedia on RadCast.
So you're joining us from Melbourne, right?
That's right. Sunny, beautiful, summery Melbourne.
It's a different season and a different day of the week. What's it? Wednesday morning for you, right?
It is Wednesday morning and it's going to be about 30 degrees Celsius today.
Well, it's Tuesday night over here and it's been sort of galing all day. Just
heavy rain, strong wind. About 5 degrees,
exact opposite.
Something like that.
So it's taken supreme sort of organizational skills to get this one sorted out, but we're all in the same place at the same time. So that's amazing. And we'll just crack on then. So can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your career in radiology to date?
Well, I started off as an aspiring brain surgeon from the age of 13 and didn't really think about that decision until I was 27 and had started training. And then I realized it was a terrible idea. Terrible because I don't have the attention span. I think you need to really be able to focus so much on one small area and put everything else aside. Whereas I know that Friday afternoon, it would have been slapdash. I would have wanted to go home. And so had a bit of a career crisis. Was going to give up medicine entirely, but my then girlfriend, now wife, had always wanted to do radiology, so I thought, what the heck, I'll apply and see what happens. I think that's probably the most important decision I've made. Not so much doing radiology, although that's been, obviously important for the shape of my career, but not doing surgery is probably the most important and correct decision I've made. And then that's not to say that it's not great that there are people willing and able to do it. I think it's amazing that they can do it, but it wasn't for me. And then I trained and I didn't stray that far. I did neuroradiology. And then during my training, I started Radiopaedia. And gradually over the years, the focus of my career is slowly but inexorably moving towards focusing on Radiopaedia away from clinical medicine, although I'm still working 3 days a week at the hospital.
Can you take us back to the start of the Radiopaedia journey then? So how did it all begin?
as an elaborate procrastination exercise. My wife and I went through radiology in parallel. So we were in the same study group and we were studying for our board exams or our final exams. It's about an 18-month proper study process where you put aside most of your life to just focus on these exit exams. And my wife is like a Hermione Granger. She's super bright, super hardworking. For 18 months, that's essentially all she did. And I, as I mentioned, I have a terribly short attention span. So I really couldn't see myself studying as many hours as she did. So instead, I started mucking around with study adjacent things that I could pretend were related. And so Radiopaedia was like, oh, this way I can put my study notes online and have them from anywhere. That's a very sensible way to spend 40 hours tinkering with Linux and scrounging together parts to build a little server and things. And that was back in 2005. And there was no entrepreneurial spirit to it at all.
Right.
There was no sense that it would end up being anything like this or even a hope of it. It was just something I started doing in the way that others would, I don't know, do model aircraft or learn to paint watercolors or something. It was just a hobby.
When you set it up, you're using the wiki sort of program, which is the same thing that they use for Wikipedia, and that does allow for sort of open source contribution. Was that just the most straightforward way you knew of getting your cases online? You weren't actually planning to get other people to contribute at that stage?
Radiopaedia, as the name suggests, is really a radiology version of Wikipedia. At least it was in the way that I sort of envisaged it at the very start. Remembering that in 2005, Wikipedia was still pretty new. And people had started becoming aware of it. It would still be pretty common to find people that had never heard of it. In fact, probably, the majority of non-interested people would not have heard of Wikipedia back then. But there were starting to be articles on just how remarkable Wikipedia was as a concept and how unexpectedly successful it had been, not in terms of generating interest, but in the quality of the content that you could generate using a open edit model. And I contributed a bit to Wikipedia, but I just found there's the disingenuous answer and then the honest answer. The disingenuous answer is I contributed and found that the tone of the website really didn't align with what you would want to access as a radiology trainee or a radiologist. And that is true. But if I'm being brutally honest, I wanted to build something myself.
Right.
I've always enjoyed creating things. And so part of the fun was the setting it up and the having autocratic control over it. And so, yes, it was natural for me to kind of set up the same kind of site using the same software that's open source. And that worked great because it removed the first hurdle. There was a solution. And I've spoken to many people over the years who have come asking advice on how they want to start their own version of Radiopaedia in whatever sphere of education they want. And each time they have these grand plans of wanting to start their own completely bespoke software. And each time I do my best to convince them that is a terrible, insane idea and that you need to remove as many impediments as possible to begin with and just focus on the content. And so MediaWiki was great for that. It allowed me to focus on the content and in the process also understand what worked and what didn't. And almost invariably with projects like this, the shape that you think you want the final product to be, no matter how much you think it over, it is completely off target by the time you actually get into it and start doing it. And so, a piece of advice for anyone who wants to do anything, not just setting up something like this, is spend less time at the front end concentrating on what you think the overall shape should be get into it as quickly as possible. And as soon as you do, you'll quickly notice that your preconceived ideas of what it should be like are not right, and you should be as flexible as possible. And so having started with zero cost and zero overhead and very little time, over the next year or two, it became obvious what the shortcomings of that content management system were. And then we sort of embarked upon this fool's errand of creating your own website from scratch.
So often when sort of companies and organizations develop and grow to be very large, it's sort of a slowly then or gradually then suddenly trajectory. Is that what you experienced?
No, not really. For us, it's been gradual for the last, 17 years now.
17 years, it's been that long.
Yeah. So
wow.
There's been no explosion. It's been really organic. And that's partially just how it is and partially by design, because every edit, every case that's contributed, every article that's written needs to be moderated by volunteer editors. So if we suddenly, let's say we spent $100,000 on a media campaign to encourage everyone to contribute cases, and we were wildly successful, and suddenly we had a 10-fold spike in case contributions all of a sudden. We can't grow the other side of the community. And
interesting, yeah.
And so the organic sort of slow growth has kept pace at each sort of part of the site. We can keep up with the IT and development feature side. We can keep up with the costs. We can keep up with the moderation. So it's been good. And this, again, is an enormous difference between companies that have funding from investors, or where the founder is entrepreneurial and has, sunk all their life savings and need to start making a living off it within a couple of years, or whatever sort of financial plan they've created. That's never been how we've operated, and it's given us a lot of freedom to do things that really financially would probably make no sense whatsoever.
How hard was it to manage the transition going from being a one-man band to a larger organization?
Well, again, it's been very gradual, because it was one person and then it was 1.1 people, because there was someone who started contributing a little bit, and then it was 1.2 and so on. Most of my efforts over the last 5 years have been around making the site as frank independent as possible. And we're slowly getting to a scale where that's possible. We're still not there, in that it would be difficult to find one person to do all the bits and pieces that I happen to still do. But I sort of look at what I do and try and describe and carve off a section, and then find someone to do that. Because at some point, I will want to step away from it to more or less. And the other side of it, I guess, is, there's a chance that I get hit by a bus at some point. And it would be a shame to then find that 17 years of work fell over because it relied on me. But it has been very gradual as well. And that's challenging because, as I said at the start, I kind of like to do things and I like to be in control. But you need to step away and allow others to take ownership and make decisions, in the same way as if you've got kids. There's a tendency of wanting to do things for your kids, but at some point you have to let them grow up and make their own mistakes, or not necessarily mistakes, just do things differently.
Interesting. Seems like fundamentally you are focused on the democratization of radiology knowledge and just knowledge in general. Would you say that's sort of your central mission? Yes,
absolutely. I think medical publishing is a strange beast in that it has some of the highest profit margins of any industry, and it generates income by restricting access to that information. And that model, I'm not a socialist or a communist in any way. I think everyone's allowed to do whatever they want within the spirit of the law. And that model is absolutely fine when the thing that you are locking away behind a paywall is the next episode of some Star Wars franchise. And people can choose, and if they don't want it, they don't have to pay for it, and they don't need to watch it, and that's perfectly fine. Morally, I find it a little bit harder to justify when the thing that you're putting behind a paywall is knowledge that is required by our colleagues in other parts of the world to treat our fellow man better. We all operate within financial constraints that necessitate some kind of remuneration at some point. I mean, we do it through advertising and supporters and some of our courses to high income nations because we do have costs as well. But I think there are fairer models than the pay or don't access. And the shame is that the people that need it the most are those who are also in the worst financial position to be able to access that information. So most of the Western high income, highly educated, good resourced nations like Australia, they're the ones that can pay $1,000 subscription a year or have libraries that pay that sort of subscription to a lot of journals or can buy textbooks, etc. But they don't really need it because they're already getting great teaching and they've already got great infrastructure. So the idea of creating a site that has a different model to allow everyone to access as much of that information as possible is at the core of it. And the other thing that I think is really important is, and this grows out of the Wikipedia model as well, that the separation of people into consumers of knowledge versus authors of knowledge or creators of knowledge, that's an artificial distinction. And it's one that goes back to when there were a few monks in a monastery laboriously copying out a manuscript.
Before the printing press.
Well, and even after that, it was, you had to choose who was an author and who wasn't to decide which things to print. That's no longer the case. And after 17 years of watching contributors from around the world of various levels of expertise and seniority, it's really obvious that for many important educational sort of tasks, you don't need to be a professional author or a professor of something. And to give a platform where each person can contribute within the bounds of their expertise, whatever that happens to be, it means that suddenly you have access to a much larger group of people that can help each other. And one of the reasons that I'm sort of gradually pivoting away from clinical medicine to spending more of my time focusing on Radiopaedia is that I genuinely think I can have more of an impact doing this than I can reading meningioma follow-up MRIs at work. Because someone else will read that anyway, right?
So do you think that all academic work should be free to access?
No, I don't think it has to be free to access. I think you have to pay the bills. So it depends the model that you choose.
Yeah.
And I think you should try and do as much good as you can and pick the model that allows you to maximize that good. And unlike the next, installment of some Star Wars series, the main importance here is doing good, not making money. And that's why, having never had to have investors and having not relied on Radiopaedia as the way that I pay my mortgage or something like that, has allowed to make decisions that financially wouldn't have made sense. I do find it interesting that when you think of how the average journal article gets produced, you have clinician. Let's talk about a radiology article. You have radiologists that are employed in a publicly funded teaching hospital who do research supported by a publicly funded teaching hospital, often during hours, using scans or equipment or resources that are part of that hospital, funded by taxpayers. You then submit that journal article to a journal, and if it's a good one, you won't have to pay to have it published, but many of them will charge you to publish it.
Mm.
You hand over the copyright to that manuscript when you submit it. That manuscript then gets sent to a reviewer who's doing it for free while their wages being paid probably by a teaching hospital. And then if you end up getting published, the library of your teaching hospital has to pay a subscription to access that journal article.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're surprised that they have the highest profit margins of any industry, especially now that they're not even printing paper. It's like, well, where does the cost come into it?
It's the financialization of everything, really. It seems sad that the main incentive for a lot of academia now is financial rather than just the pursuit of knowledge.
It's about where you start from. What's the main reason you begin the thing that you're going to do? And if the main reason you're doing it is to make money, then you're going to make different choices.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you maybe sacrifice some profit for your mission, which I suppose is a noble thing that you've taken the decision to do yourself, but you can't expect other people to act in that way, can you, ultimately?
So I think we've made lots of decisions that have not been, especially to begin with, or still, really. I mean, we could still be charging 2 or 3 times as much for our courses.
Yeah.
When you look at so we have got what we call an all access pass, which is, so I guess I should just explain the distinction between what we charge for and what we don't. So all the cases and all the articles and all the multiple choice questions on the site are entirely free. You don't even need to log in to access that. Our courses and learning pathways, etc., they just take too long to produce and require a small number of people to produce it. And we have a virtual conference every year which has 60 or so speakers, and we don't want just the same lecture they've given 100 times before. So we ask to have specific topics. We push back. We say we don't like these slides. We want it recorded. We want the good quality audio as much as possible, etc. And we found that to get really good quality, you have to pay. I mean, again, most conferences don't pay their speakers, right? Or they pay an honorarium that might be a bottle of wine or something. And we want people to feel like it's okay for us to tell them what we want because they're getting remunerated. And so courses and lectures, etc., we pay for, and that money has to come from somewhere. And so for high income regions, they're behind a paywall, and that allows us to not only pay for the speakers but to make it available completely free for all low and middle income nations,
right,
as defined by the WHO, which is about 122 or so nations or regions. And all of that content that is behind a paywall for high-income regions, you can purchase access to that on a subscription plan, which is what we call an all-access pass. And the cost of that, even for the highest tier within the highest income nations, so Australia, the US, the UK, etc., is still a fraction of what most conferences charge for online attendance for one conference. So this is definitely not a situation where we are setting our price based on, maximizing our profit. We're setting our price to make sure that we can pay our speakers and that we can subsidize access for everyone else for free and contribute to the ongoing development of the website and the bandwidth costs, etc. We could be an entirely different organization if what we were trying to do is fulfill the expectation of shareholders or maximize our own income, etc. And for everyone involved, we have jobs, and in most parts of the world, being a radiologist is a pretty well-paying profession. So we don't need to focus on that, and we try and focus on creating the best site we can and doing the most good we can with it, whilst remaining financially viable.
Have you ever been approached by a big publishing house like Elsevier?
In a dark alley with a truncheon?
Asking
No.
if they could make you an interesting offer or something like that.
No,
And then
no
put
one
everything
has.
behind a paywall.
No one has. I'm not going to pretend that I don't have a price. I'm sure there is some number at which I'd be willing to sell Radiopaedia, but I'm pretty sure that price is significantly away from any price that would be reasonably offered. So I have not sorted it. It's not even in my longer term plans. My exit strategy is not really to eventually sell Radiopaedia. My exit strategy is to find a way that it can continue without me being as involved initially, and then without me being around in some form. Yeah, and find a mechanism. Find a mechanism for that to occur that makes sense for everyone involved and doesn't betray all the work that people have contributed to it.
Yeah, you'll need to find someone who has the same belief in the mission statement and that doesn't just go looking for a bid.
Well,
from,
that's
the
more
Tim
and
Cook
more
to your Steve Jobs.
Yes, more and more we have a core of senior editors, etc., who've been with the site for nearing a decade, I guess, and who do share that. So I think that succession planning is well and truly on the way. I don't have any fears about that. The thing to remember is that over 17 years, so the first 7 years there weren't that many people involved, but now there's an entire generation of young radiologists who have grown up with Radiopaedia, and many of our editors who may have started off as trainees are now middle career radiologists. So it's a very different position to be in than at the start.
What proportion of people who use the site currently do actually contribute, and how do you incentivize people to do that?
So proportion is hard because we don't ask people to log in. So the proportion of people who read Radiopaedia articles versus those who make any kind of edit on the site of any type is tiny. Much less than 1%, probably less than 0.1%. And that's okay. As I said before, I don't think we could cope if suddenly everyone decided to contribute. In terms
I suddenly feel very guilty.
No, it's fine. Look at where we are. It's worked perfectly fine. In terms of incentivizing, I think what we are keenest on is finding people who, when we describe or they become aware of what we're trying to accomplish, that resonates with them, and that they want to do it because they are interested in doing it and want to contribute to our mission of trying to create this resource and make it available to as many people as possible, as easily as possible. And in so doing, positively affect how people are diagnosed and treated, with a focus on regions where they struggle to do that. So the incentivization is really just more explanation of what we're trying to do, and then finding people that want to do that. We're not interested in becoming yet another source for people to fluff up their CV.
Yeah.
There's already plenty of online journals where you pay to publish, or where they have dubious peer review process, and where their entire reason for existing is this commoditization of publications. And we know there are people, especially as Radiopaedia becomes better known, no doubt some users are contributing cases merely so they can list it on their CV before applying. And that's okay. I mean, we're quite happy for the world to become a better place as a result of people's, self-serving actions that happen to go in that direction anyway. And there's no judgment here. It's like that's perfectly fine, but it's not something we focus on. What we really want to foster and encourage are people to join us in building this together collaboratively, and not just contribute in isolation, but become part of our community. And one of the greatest joys that's come out of this process, and extremely unexpected, and for anyone who knows me well, it will seem really odd because I'm not much of a people person, really. It's that out of this site, we now have a community of editors. It's about 100, and then a larger contributor community where so many friendships have been made and so many people have caught up in different countries when they go visiting, and we talk online all the time. And really finding people that want to be part of that community is the thing we're most interested in.
Do people always act in good faith when they're editing? You know, you get like people trolling on Wikipedia and making stuff up.
always is a difficult word. 99.9999% of the time, almost all of them are demonstrably not only in good faith, but actually in the right direction. We do get spammers a bit. Right. We've had to build various ways of making it unappealing for people to promote Viagra tablets or whatever website they want. And realistically, the effort that they need to go into creating an account, posting content that then isn't visible to anyone, that takes a few seconds for our editors to delete it and ban their account, means that even then we get very little of that. And by little, I mean 1 or 2 a month. Well, and I think this is the lesson that Wikipedia has taught us, and that we kind of also demonstrate, is you can take just a huge number of people with very few controls, and provided you create the right incentives and constraints, people will generally do the right thing. You know, we're not very appealing for people who want to be trolls. There's plenty of other places for that.
You present a very sort of idealistic view of the world, which is different to what we sort of hear about nowadays. Like, it seems like you appeal to people's better nature, and as a result, you get people acting in sort of altruistic ways and just doing stuff based on wanting to further the mission rather than helping themselves. So, I mean, it seems to work for Radiopaedia.
I think the reality is that that's what the world is actually like. What we don't do is we don't amplify trolls.
And when you think different incentive model,
when you think of why you have the view that the world is filled with divisive, hateful, destructive people, and you just sort of mentally audit where that view comes from. It comes from the news, where you're not going to see the nightly news saying, and in all of these suburbs, nothing happened. So you just select the bad stuff. And in a city of Melbourne that's 5 million people or something, the nightly news only talks about the 2 or 3 tragedies or badly behaved people that particular day. When you think of social media, it's dominated by posts that create controversy of some kind, or cause reactions in people, outrage or anger. And Twitter's a great example for that. People will respond to things that make their blood boil. All of that activity floats to the top, but I don't think it's representative of what's actually going on. I mean, there are 7 billion people on Earth or something.
Is it just gone over 8 now, I think?
8? There's a lot of people, and most of them are the vast majority are living decent, quiet lives where they're trying to help their communities. And we just don't see that because of the actions of a few, and that we give them incentives to do it by giving them more clicks and more views, and as a result, more money, etc. I think if you can create an organization or a space where that's not incentivized, then you actually get to see people's true colors. So it sounds a bit optimistic, which is a bit unusual, I think, for me.
Yes, it seems to work. Speaking of Viagra promotion, do you have a say as to the adverts that appear on the site?
Yes and no. So we have a broad say into categories of adverts and keywords and the sort of advertising that we want and don't. And if we ever see an ad that we don't like, or someone points it out, then we can get it pulled.
Right.
we do all our advertising through third parties, advertising networks, and there's no way of vetting every single ad, unfortunately. They don't really pick and choose their own ads either, because these are instantaneous online auctions of advertising through many agencies. So there's probably 3 or 4 layers before you get to someone saying yes or no to a particular image. But overall, I think it depends where you are, what you see, and what your previous browsing history has been, and all of that. We have lots of categories of advertising that we don't have on the site, or that we shouldn't. And if we see it, then we get annoyed. And we don't have gambling. We don't have pornography. We try and avoid scammy weight loss ones and those sort of supplement ones. But it's a difficult area. We'd love to not rely on advertising. And, gradually we are becoming less reliant on it by having more supporters and more income from the courses, etc., while still being free. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to ensuring that our content is as easily available. And at the moment, that still requires the bills to be paid by advertising. But if anyone doesn't want to see the ads, then we'd love them to become supporters, because one, their experience of the site is much better. And 2, it means that we can plan financially a bit better, because it's much less fickle than advertising.
So what are the current visitor numbers like compared to back in 2007?
Well, in 2007, it was mostly me clicking frantically on the site. No, by the end of 2007, we were getting about 30,000 page views a month.
That's huge still.
Which is pretty big. I mean, some of the smaller journals, radiology journals, have distributions that are in the single-digit thousands of radiologists. And many of those radiologists would just throw the journal into the bin without ever unwrapping it. Some of them, right. Some of us actually leaf through it. So considering each of those leaf through a page view, 30,000, I think, already in 2007 rivaled the readership of some of these smaller journals. So now I need to get my figures right. Every month, we are read by about 4 million individual users who read about 20 to 25 million page views a month.
Wow.
It's just
staggering
to comprehend. Yeah, I know. Do those numbers, how do they make you feel? It must just be surreal that
it's absolutely surreal. And they cease to have any kind of grounding in reality. The times that it kind of strikes me just how large we've become is how uncommon it is to find someone in radiology who does not use Radiopaedia.
They're not doing it very well if they're not using Radiopaedia, that's for sure.
It's become a term in its own right, hasn't it? Instead of saying, look it up on the internet, have a look on Radiopaedia.
I'm not sure. I haven't heard it used as a verb yet, but maybe.
Radiopaedia, I'm sure I have, yeah. What's the sort of geographical distribution of the users? Is it mainly, are you reaching a lot of less economically developed countries?
Yeah, so I think that generally our readership is roughly proportional to English language speaking.
Okay.
With about 30% in North America, 30% in Europe, and the rest everywhere else. With an enormous hole in China, where
probably firewalled.
Probably are, but there's literally single digit users. But everywhere else is represented.
That's it. That's interesting. There's probably some language element to that as well. You don't translate the site, do you?
No, and it's been we would love to, in the wave a magic wand, make it happen kind of way. But to actually make it happen is really problematic, because how do you moderate the translation? Like, how does that start? you get the first user who says, I'm a Spanish-speaking radiologist, I'd love to translate the site. And you think, okay, great. And now what? Like, how do you check that what they've translated?
Yeah.
The first steps are really difficult. It's sort of understandable how you would get to, once you've got an entire editorial board that's in a separate language, and how that becomes self-sustaining. But the first steps are really difficult. And I think it's probably not that necessary. I suspect automatic translation is getting much, much better. And English, for whether it's good or bad, is kind of the lingua franca of medicine.
So something that's relatively new to your offering is the Radiopaedia conference, which I can attest to being very popular in the department where I work. So how did that come about? Was it a way of kind of helping to cover the costs, or was it that you wanted to develop some extra material away from kind of the normal stuff that you were getting on the site?
The conference itself came about because of COVID. So we had been running courses, physical courses, that we would record and then make those recordings available for free for all low and middle income nations, and sort of had created the model of courses. And but we'd been stuck with the idea that courses were something that we wanted to be live. And there is something about a live performance, if you want, that is different to a pre-recorded one. It's not necessarily better. It's just different. And our initial desire was to backtrack. The reason the course idea sort of came to life was after I traveled to the West Coast of the US for an advanced neuroradiology conference, which, my department paid for, and I flew business class and I stayed in a nice hotel. And I sat in the audience watching some pretty good speakers talk about neuroradiology. And this was years ago. And there was one of my cases. And I recognized it because it was an unusual diagnosis. And I had my laptop with me so I could just check that was my image. I had to do that because they hadn't bothered to acknowledge me. But it was still felt pretty cool, right? Because I went to this big name conference with big name speakers and they were using my cases, and it was a moment of, wow, people are actually using my website. And then
you could have made them look really silly, be like, oh, nice case, where did you get it from?
Yeah, well, there's a story behind that too. But as the lecture went on, there were more and more of my cases, and I recognized, a dozen or so, and none of them were attributed. And my initial response, I think, as anyone who has something taken from them, I felt sort of violated, I guess, at some point. And my initial knee-jerk response was, how do I change this to make it harder for people to use the images? And after I sort of calmed down and a few Negronis, I realized that actually, and this is, again, a difference between digital versus real world, in that they hadn't really taken anything from me because they didn't stop me earning an income.
Yeah.
I still had the case. I could still use it. So what had happened was that person took less time to create a lecture than they otherwise would have. And presumably the time they saved, they either spent doing something else interesting or something that they enjoyed doing or that other people benefited from more. And the lecture that they gave had better examples perhaps than what they would have found otherwise, which meant the teaching that the people got in the room was better. So it sounded like a sort of a good outcome, even though it's let's say, rude for them not to acknowledge it. But I didn't want to stop that use. So in fact, we just made it easier for people to download images and attribute them properly. But what sitting in that room, having traveled business class and sitting in a hotel to look at my own cases and having spent, a couple of $1,000 in registration fees, it occurred to me that, one, that it was pretty silly for me to have done that, but two, that most of the people in that room were the people that least needed to be there, and that the people who would really benefit from that experience were people who could never afford to fly business class or any class to the US, probably couldn't even get visas to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And that this whole industry of conferences where exorbitant fees are paid to generate income for a department or an organization to show cases and give talks to people who don't need to see it so that they can justify traveling to a nice city and having a bit of a holiday. It's fine as a business model, but it's something that the world, doesn't really need. And what they do need is access to that kind of teaching in places where they're stuck. And so that was why we started doing physical conferences that we recorded. And the model there was we would subsidize the free access by having a paid course locally and be able to pay the speakers and all of that. And we did that for a number of years and had a number of these courses scheduled for whatever year it was that COVID started. And we had to cancel all of those. And we thought, well, what do we do instead? And we'd been talking about doing a conference, but we were talking about doing a physical conference before that. And it always sounded just too hard. When this restriction came, this constraint, we thought, well, why don't we just do it virtually? And we'll present some of the talks that we were going to give in person, record them. And that worked out great. And in fact, it's become now a really important part of our yearly calendar. And it's big, largely because it's attended by people who aren't paying for it. But we have about 10,000 delegates last year, which makes it a really big conference. And if we had made the mistake of making it an in-person physical conference, the vast majority of those people would not be able to attend. And so I think it was a really good outcome for what was a difficult couple of years. And the benefit it also has had is that those lectures, and again, we don't just ask speakers to come and talk and then just see what they turn up with. We tend to create a program that fits both together for a cohesive experience when you're attending the conference, but also so that those lectures can be used later as part of our All Access Pass and to create lecture collections that really cover all the important topics and fill in the gaps as we go.
Yeah, looking through the program of, I think, last year's conference, it's really hefty, isn't it? Like 4 days. Is it 4 days or 5 days of?
It was 5 days.
Content? Yeah,
5 days. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really high quality lectures. So I mean, it's a massive achievement to be able to get all of those people together. And I suppose paying them makes sure that they produce it's about maintaining that quality, isn't it?
Yes, I think again, there are many conferences where it's a little bit hard to understand why they run it.
Yeah.
Like the conference seems to exist mostly because it has run last year and they move to a different city and they get conveners who can't say no for whatever reason or think that it looks good on their CV. And then those conveners ask, beg, browbeat, guilt friends and loved ones into speaking, even though those people don't necessarily want to speak and don't really want to put in the time. And so they dust off some old lecture and put in the least effort. And then they just go to the dinner afterwards and get drunk.
But the conference gets to sell space in the hall to vendors. Right.
So yes, you have lots of that's a reason. But even there, I don't know. It used to be that physical conferences were one of the few opportunities for people to see the hardware that they might need to purchase. There was some opportunities there, and that's still the case for the larger conferences. And it was one of the few opportunities you had to speak to these vendors without having to write a letter. But a lot of these are anachronistic now. Yes, you still need to see the hardware, but you're not seeing it in a real way. If you go to the stand of an MRI manufacturer, it's not like they've got a real MR running. It's just a mock-up.
Imagine.
And so you're still needing to do a site visit or get real scanned. I don't know. The whole thing, and it's palpable when you go to some of these conferences that no one really knows why they're there. There's no there's no cohesive sense of what people are trying to accomplish. And the
it's just
social
CPD, isn't it, for the portfolio ultimately?
Yes, don't get me started on that particular bugbear. But yes, there's an entire industry built around this, and I'm not sure that it's optimized to the benefit of society and patients. In fact, I'm almost certain that it's not.
But you do get CPD for attending the Radiopaedia conference, don't you?
You do, and we're in the process of becoming CME accredited as well.
Oh.
So,
Have to play the game.
Well, you kind of do. And more importantly, I think CPD, with all of the problems that it has in terms of the way that it's implemented, and this is not speaking about the accreditation, but about the requirements. The idea behind CPD is obvious and necessary and important. We all know, however, that there's an entire industry built around providing activities with points where the emphasis is not aligned with the actual intention of CPD, meaning that you can acquire points while not actually learning very much. And especially if you go somewhere sunny or somewhere with good snow. And you set down the rules, and you shouldn't be surprised that people optimize within that. And it's not that I haven't chosen certain conferences based on where they're located. Everyone does. But we're trying to create content that actually helps you be a better radiologist.
Yeah.
And not being able to give out CPD points means that's getting in the way of us accomplishing that, because some people will not come because they can't get the points and will choose somewhere else. Yeah. So I think it is important in pursuing our goal to make it as attractive as possible from that point of view as well.
Coming back to your own career now, if you sort of zoom out, what impact has Radiopaedia sort of had on it in general? And would you say it's been all good?
On my career personally?
On your career, yes.
Essentially, yes, all good. I mean, I'm in this incredibly fortunate position of having a career aside from being a clinician, and realizing too late now that if I was forced to remain a full-time clinician, I would probably slowly descend into a spiral of self-medication and depression. And Radiopaedia has given me the opportunity to create something. And I think different people's brains work in different ways. And something I hadn't really understood about myself was how important the ability to look back and be able to point to the thing that I had spent my time doing was. And radiology is an amazing subspecialty in so many ways. And many of the things that make it so appealing is the fact that at the end of the day, you just walk away and you can work part-time, full-time, you can locum, you can move, you can change countries, you can do online work, you can do all sorts of different ways of being a radiologist. And a lot of those stem from the fact that you don't own patients, and the scans are, in 5 to 15 minute small atomic bits of work. And so you can just go and leave, and you don't need to worry about it unless you're running your own practice, But the result of that is, if you just work in a hospital and you just report, at the end of a career, you just have a pile of reports to look at. And I don't find that enough. I think if you're in private practice, you can point to your private practice. If you're in academia, you can point to all your research endeavors and your publications. But I needed something, and Radiopaedia is something I can point to. The time that I've spent builds upon itself, and the hours that I spent fiddling with the site in 2008 are still there.
Yeah.
It's sort of like when you visit a city that's been there for thousands of years, like Rome or something, and you walk past buildings that have at the very bottom, chunks of marble that were put there by a Roman 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago. That work remains there. It's not just washed away.
Are some of your early articles on there still?
Well, I mean, yes, they're all there, and they get added to and refined and rewritten and edited.
And they're not kept in their original form for historical.
No, we do have revision history, so you can go back and have a look at what articles look like all the way back. But yeah, so I think that for me turns out is really important. And if I hadn't had that, then I would have probably doubled down on my academic career to build that. I'm not very entrepreneurial, so I don't think I would have gone into private practice. But no, so the ability to do this is wonderful. And also I genuinely think I've accomplished more through my work with Radiopaedia than I have ever or could ever have accomplished as a clinician directly.
Yeah. On a much, 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 much smaller scale, I can semi-relate to that in terms of RadCast. Like it's something other than the sort of day-to-day clinical that just gives a bit of variety and purpose, I suppose.
And growing something is rewarding, though.
Yeah, that as well.
And when you spend such a large portion of your life learning about the human body and then looking at it in more and more detail, to then have to pick up skills that are kind of completely unrelated to that is quite refreshing.
Oh, absolutely. And particularly as you get older, it becomes really easy to go through years, if not decades, of not doing anything new.
Yeah,
that's very true.
and you see that if you have, older parents, depending. My mum's great, but my father, he can write an SMS on his phone and use it as a phone, and that's it. And he's now actually trapped in a world that has moved on, and he at some point forgot how to learn to do new things, probably about 30 years ago, and it's a easy trap to fall into. And if you have a job that makes it easy to not learn new things because you're just doing the same thing over and over again, then I think you can just turn around and notice that you haven't grown in that way.
Absolutely.
So a job like Radiopaedia, because the scale of it has changed and the role that I've had to take on has changed, I don't do any IT things myself anymore. I haven't for a decade.
Yeah.
But I've had to do administrative and CEO-ish type stuff, which I would never have thought of doing. And so you end up learning, being forced to learn and forced to change. And I think that's a great boon.
Yeah, it keeps the mind active, keeps you sort of, keeps you young, I suppose, mentally. Has the success of Radiopaedia led to any interesting offers for work perhaps outside of radiology?
Not really. We're very much a giant fish in a tiny barrel because everyone in radiology knows us, but probably dermatologists don't. You don't even need to leave medicine to find areas that have never heard of us. And then outside of that, we're nobody.
Yeah.
I don't get recognized when I go to the restaurant or something. Thank God. I mean, I've had at a couple of conferences, I've had people come up having recognized me and wanting a selfie. And that was a very bizarre, surreal experience. But that's probably the weirdest experience that I've had.
Aside from Radiopaedia and radiology, what do you do to wind down?
It's been quite challenging to find any time to have a hobby. It's not actually finding the time. It's finding the willingness to do a hobby for enough time to make it enjoyable without my mind deciding, shouldn't you be spending time more constructively?
Yeah.
And I suspect for anyone who has a self-employed component, that little voice that says, oh, you could always be doing more on your business or
Very true,
your
yeah.
project. And so I am currently trying to play guitar again. But at the same time, the kids are not going to be kids for very much longer. Mm-hmm. And it's such a genuine pleasure to hang out with them. So much of my downtime is spent, we listen to audiobooks together. We get to re-listen to all sorts of science fiction junk that I read 20 years ago. We play board games. We're painting Warhammer miniatures together. As you can tell, my boys are real jocks.
I feel like you're just living vicariously through them, aren't you?
I've failed so thoroughly to be a good Australian father to the point that my 10-year-old, we were down at the beach and they were playing beach cricket. And my 10-year-old said to me, Dad, what are those 3 sticks for? And for any of the international audience that doesn't know cricket, the 3 sticks are, I didn't have to look this up, I actually knew it. They're called a wicket. And I explained to my 10-year-old what they were. That's terrible, right?
Yeah, in Australia, that's an unforgivable sin, isn't it?
We're not very sporty. We're thoroughly geeky.
They're destined for radiology, or?
Well, that's interesting. My eldest son sometimes says he wants to do medicine, and I'm not sure. I'm fairly ambivalent about that. Okay. I think medicine has been very kind to me and to my wife, largely because I think radiology is, at least presently, still a really interesting and flexible specialty. But I don't know. I don't know if I would wish medicine upon my kids.
Yeah. Well, the working conditions of medics in Australia are a lot better than they are in the UK generally. So, I mean, if you question it in Australia, then certainly here, I probably wouldn't recommend it here.
Yeah, I'd be in that boat as well, I think.
So I think I was extraordinarily lucky to have navigated through becoming a doctor and avoiding being a surgeon and ending up accidentally in radiology and then accidentally doing Radiopaedia. But I think most of the pathways that I could have taken through medicine wouldn't have been suited to me at all, and I would have been better off doing something else, I think.
Interesting. The future, what does it hold for Radiopaedia? Just more of the same, growing the site?
Nothing momentous or catastrophic. It's just more organic growth, more improvement of the features. We're getting to a scale where we've got a larger group of developers, and what we're realizing is that over the 17 years that we've existed, our code base has become pretty messy and ugly and difficult to work with. So a lot of our effort will be to make things invisibly better, make the site faster and more easily maintained and more flexible. And that is, it's a hard thing to do because it takes time and energy and funds, which then don't have any visible benefit to users. And also I'm impatient and I want shiny new things. There's lots of things we want to do on the side. But I think for the next year or so, a large part of our efforts will be just cleaning up what we've got.
I think that's everything we wanted to cover this evening or morning. Again, it's been a real privilege to have you on and for you to tell the story of Radiopaedia. And I guess now we've ticked your name off the list, we can now retire. This will be our mic drop moment, and that'll be it. Only kidding. Don't want to scare our fans. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Great.
Oh, there you go. Lovely interview there from RadCast, packed full of the wisdom and deep thinking that listeners of this podcast have come to expect from you, Gaillard. And no goats, though.
No goats. RadCast is much more professional outfit than us. No goats allowed.
The goats didn't exist when you
No,
recorded
they
that
didn't.
one.
I should mention, though, that we keep speaking in the past tense of RadCast, but it's not actually shut down by any means. So they've stopped making the podcast, but I know they have plans. I'm not sure I can say what any of those are in public. I'm not going
Sounds
to.
like mysterious world domination plans.
It is. There's a lot of spinning on chairs and stroking of white cats, but you should keep an eye out on them. And all the previous podcast episodes are still there for the listening.
Yeah, so the podcast is finishing, but I think it's called their RadCast Academy will be continuing on. Did you work out, Gaillard, the question that I think if you were asked now, the answer would be very, very different?
Yes. Spam.
Spam, spam, spam. Sorry.
Oh, boy. 2024 has been... it's been lovely in many ways. We've made tremendous progress, but it's been tough from an IT point of view. Right now, we're in the middle of all our bugs, but at the start of the year, we had a big flurry of spammers creating literally tens of thousands of accounts to sell Viagra and Xanax online. We'd already had some anti-spam stuff built in, but there were ways that they found that they could get in and create these accounts. And so we had to stop everything and concentrate on mitigating those problems. And now they've gone away and we're back to very low levels of spam. But we did actually get one support email from a charming spammer, which I'm not sure I shared with you. But so this is not a joke. Their email was like Caroline Patterson, but I have my suspicions that is not their actual name. And the email read, "Dear Sir!" ! Your website is... Oh, and I should mention, the entire message is in title case. So every word has a capital letter, except for every time they use the word I, which is in lowercase. So, "Dear Sir, your website is awesome and I really like it. But from recent month, I have had an issue with my accounts. Whenever I sign up on radiopaedia.org with my title by insert drug name online, my account has been suspended by spam. I don't understand why my account is suspended, but 4 months ago, there is no issue of such an account suspension or spam. Can you please guide me on how to not go into spam or suspended? Thank you so very much, sir."
I think I'm a sucker for this charming spammer. I think we should let it through. Could you put a dollar estimate on how much you think it's cost to deal with the recent spam threat?
Coming up with an estimate is pretty hard, but it's substantial, not only because of the amount of time that it took, but the opportunity cost that we didn't do something more meaningful. And also, there's a reasonable chance that the horrible bugs that we're currently dealing with are actually as a result of some of the spam mitigation that we put in. But if I had to guess, it would be somewhere in the order of 50 to 100,000 in wages. So it's a lot, and it's a distraction. It's also demoralizing for our contributors and our editors and our developers and for us. And so it's a real pain. If only everyone could just get along and be nice to each other.
So it doesn't matter really how charming the spammer is. That's a lot of money. I think it's best not to have them. Before we wrap up this episode, Gaillard, the part of the interview that listening to it now really resonated with me and my experience is and I can't remember your exact wording, but the philosophy of just start doing it rather than overthinking it. What the project is, it'll evolve and it'll appear as you start doing it. For me, going from like being a trainee, contributing some cases and articles on Radiopaedia, to then managing the social media for Radiopaedia, to then recording YouTube tutorials, and then being invited to present at a conference, and then teaching courses, and then running an annual conference myself, and then starting this podcast. It's all happened, but there was never a plan for that. It's just trying new things, making interesting stuff that's as good as you can make it at the time, but not holding things back because they aren't perfect. I think that's the key thing. It's like, start doing it. It's not going to be perfect. Don't hold it back. Still put it out there, and things will just progress.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I don't think our tiny little monkey brains are any good at working out the details of what you actually want. They trick you into thinking you know what you want, and you can spend all this time preparing plans that then are actually in the wrong decision. I was trying to explain this to my eldest son, who tends to overcomplicate the plans. And I think I came up with a pretty good metaphor for how I see this. And imagine you're standing at the edge of a really wide lake on a misty day where you can barely see the opposite shore.
Quite a few lakes in New Zealand, so I'm picturing this.
You can just make out some of the features. And this lake is a special lake because there are stepping stones kind of all the way through it. But you can only see the first, 10 meters or so. Now, you could spend ages crafting a cunning, detailed plan of exactly the course you're going to take. But the reality is that you just need to take a step and then take another one. And those stones are still there. You can always back out. But more importantly, as you get closer to the shore, you're going to make out details that change where you want to go. And so all that effort in planning is not only not very accurate because you can't see where you want to go, but it's actually wasted because that's not where you're going to want to go when you get there. And Radiopaedia is an exact example of that. There's nothing about the site as it is today that was the way that I was picturing it 20 years ago.
The other thing is that all that time you spend on doing planning, how many things get stopped in the planning phase, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You go into such detailed planning and then you get bored of it and you're like, oh, no, and you stop doing it. Whereas if you had just started, you would have actually realized what works, what doesn't work, and you would have actually continued on.
Well, and you don't get any reward from planning.
Yeah,
you get reward from putting stuff out there. So if you use up all your energy coming up with the world's greatest plan and then you're knackered and you're done, that's it.
All right, well, it's time to wrap this Thing 1 and Thing 2 episode up, Gaillard. How can people get in contact with us? Not with Thing 3 picks.
Please don't. We are, of course, at Radiopaedia on X and Instagram, as well as at Frank Gaillard and at Dr. Andrew Dixon. Or, even better, for me at least, you can email us at podcast@radiopaedia.org with any ideas and feedback, but no Thing 3 picks.
No Thing 3s. It sounds silly, but showing us that you're listening, enjoying the podcast, writing to us, tweeting to us, it really does help keep us motivated.
Yeah.
Analytics saying that 3,000 people listened to last week's episode, ultimately means nothing compared to receiving a message that has some genuine sentiment in it. And I think this applies beyond our podcast, really. Anything creative or educational in the world that you're enjoying consuming, don't be afraid to reach out, communicate your appreciation to the creators of that thing, because it's probably the best way to ensure that it continues on into the future.
Yes, but if you want to help support Radiopaedia in a more tangible way, then you can become a paid supporter via the website or purchase an all-access pass to our online courses and conference, which is coming up. And don't forget that in doing so, you'll enable us to give free access to the conference to people in 100. What are you giggling about? You're not going to edit this. You're just going to leave it all in, have me floundering like a fish.
And what else can people do to help us out, Gaillard?
And you can also help us out by leaving a 5-star review in the podcast app.
The funny thing is that no one's going to be listening to this part of the podcast. It's gone for way too long.
Yeah, and they're like, Marcus finished, done.
And we'll catch you all again sometime soon in the reading room.
Stay rad, everyone. Stay rad.
Stay rad.
Check your Thing 3.
Yeah. See you, mate. See you in a couple of weeks.
See ya. Bye-bye. I'm 50, Dixon.
You know what congratulations. You know what my wife said? We were out. She was a bit drunk, and someone just worked out that I had something to do with Radiopaedia, and she was a medical, like GP trainee or something. She's like, oh, so is it a podcast for Radiopaedia? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, oh, I should have a listen. And then my wife's like, yeah, have a listen. Let me know if he sounds condescending to you too. I was like, oh man, way to shoot me down.
Thanks, honey.
It's like
Thanks.
His persona in the podcast is condescending.
Yeah, that could be the 5-star review. Condescending.